Okay, this is 18.1, injury prevention. So first, what I'm going to talk about is extrinsic risk factors. So the first one is coaching. Coaching can be the cause of injury. I'll describe and explain how this can be. There are many factors that can influence injuries caused by poor coaching, such as overtraining players, teaching poor technique, allowing poor tackles and dangerous tackles to happen in training, and etc. Okay, so all these problems can happen under the coach's watch, and it's their responsibility to ensure they don't expose their players to injuries. Okay, so an example of this is if a coach is demonstrating a poor technique to the players, this can lead to the players endangering themselves or others around them. If the poor technique is repeatedly performed, it can lead to long-term injury, as the player may be getting a repetitive injury that gets worse over time. This is an extrinsic factor, as the individual is not able to control it themselves. It's an outside factor that cannot be controlled. The next one I want to talk about is incorrect technique, and I touched on this a little bit in the coaching paragraph, but poor technique is an extrinsic factor, as it is something that the player is being taught by another individual. So like we said, the coach could be teaching them the poor technique, for example. And where we assume that it's being taught to him because it's in the extrinsic side, but it could also be intrinsic if he's teaching himself that poor technique. But anyway, incorrect technique can be the cause of injury, as the player performing it can endanger others and themselves by not using the correct method. An example of this is a two-footed tackle in football, which is illegal in the rules. This type of recklessness can be the cause of the opposition becoming injured and can be prevented by the player learning the correct form. And then the next one is environmental factors. So a multitude of sub-factors come under this title. Some include temperature, playing surface, weather, etc. Okay, so say for example we have a squad of players playing on a sun-baked surface, which will lead to it to be solid. Players will have a harder landing when jumping and even just running. It creates a lot of pressure in the bones. This excessive force can be the cause of sprains or other injuries. This puts anyone on the playing surface at danger, as everyone will be affected by the environmental factors generally. This is an extrinsic factor, as the environment is not the individual's fault, as it can't be controlled by the player. Next is clothing and footwear. So this covers using the correct equipment for sport. For example, using shin pads in football. This can be the cause of injury because players, when tackling, may catch the shin, and if the player is not wearing shin pads, then the studs could cut the skin or even damage the bone. Similarly, correct footwear is a must, so as not wearing the right footwear on the right playing surface can cause injuries too, mainly around the ankles, such as a sprained ankle. An example of this is wearing football boots on a basketball court. This can lead to injury due to there being no grip, leading to the player sliding, and the studs will damage the court, possibly leading to other players getting hurt as well as a result. And then the last one I want to touch on is safety hazards. So this falls under the responsibility of the staff to eliminate all hazards that can pose a threat of injury to players. A lot of health and safety aspects need to be covered when going through a risk assessment. This includes checking the environment for any objects that could pose a threat. For example, if checks were not done and there was a rock on the pitch, for example, a player could run onto it and twist the ankle, resulting in an injury. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the staff to check the environment for the benefit of the players. This is an extrinsic factor, as it is not up to the players individually to sort out the environment and take the risk assessments to prevent these hazards. It's up to the staff. And then we move on to intrinsic risk factors. I'm going to start off with training effects. So an example of where training effects can lead to injury would be overtraining. This is due to the muscles being overworked and not given the time to repair themselves and build muscle. This can include working out 6 days a week for multiple hours a day, where you aren't giving your body that time to repair the muscles. This can lead to your muscles becoming more susceptible to injury due to them being really weak. So I did talk about overtraining on extrinsic factors as well, but the main difference here is that the player themselves is choosing to train themselves so much. So they're choosing to train themselves 6 days a week for multiple hours, whereas beforehand it was the coach telling them to overtrain. So that's the difference. And then individual variables, this is specific to each person. So say, for example, medical history. It is crucial to know your limits, to how far you can push yourself. If someone with a heart problem was to work out all the time and pushing themselves harder and harder, then they're at risk of a possible heart attack or heart-related issues. Another factor is fitness. If you perform consistent exercise, then only push a little above your level. If you do not exercise and are trying to do a workout an athlete would do, then you're at risk of injury because you aren't used to the level. So that's saying just if an average person who doesn't really exercise much is to do like, I don't know, Usain Bolt's training program or something, they're gonna feel a lot of effects because they're not used to that level of fitness. And then postural defects. This section relates to how your body is made up genetically. So an example of this can be difference in arm length, such as if the left arm was longer than the right. This can lead to uneven forces being used on different parts of the body when using weights or other such exercises. Other factors that will influence this area is bad posture in general, such as slumped over, not standing straight, so bad form. This can cause muscles to overstretch and therefore become a lot weaker and more susceptible to injuries. And then we go on to preventive measures to take. So we've got 3 here. The first one's the role of the coach. There are many ways coaches can prevent injuries of their players. One of them is to train them a correct amount and not overtrain anyone. Coaches will also have to check the equipment that the players will use, otherwise they can be held accountable for causing an injury to an extent. Another way is for coaches to teach the players the correct form. Otherwise, players will put themselves and others at risk with a poor technique. Risk assessments also have to be taken by the coach, so they have a lot to do. So basically, coaches just generally have a lot to do in terms of injury prevention. Equipment. So, like I said, I just sort of touched on this with the role of the coach. Coaches and staff will check all equipment to make sure it's suitable for activity and that nothing is broken or can lead to an injury. This should be covered in a risk assessment, but equipment such as clothing for players of footballs, for example. So say if football is pumped too much, these could be the cause for concussion. This is why risk assessment can prevent this injury from happening. So just regular checks, just checking all the equipments at a good level before training or games. And then environment has to be assessed due to the playing surface, weather conditions, etc. This can influence the chance of injuries, such as a wet playing surface, meaning players may come together more frequently due to less grip with their shoes and the grass. This decision will be up to the referee, and it is rare that games are cancelled for these reasons, but it's very important to take into account as it could be the reason for injuries. So if there's like a thunder warning or a storm, possibly, then refs may cancel the game. And then last is how can risk factors be minimised via utilisation of these measures. So I'll mainly just talk about risk assessments here. So risk factors can be greatly decreased by putting in some actions that need to be taken before games or training. For example, a risk assessment of the equipment before training can decrease the chance of an injury of a player, as there could be something wrong with the equipment, such as an overpumped ball, which then could lead to a possible head injury if struck at the head too hard. Risk assessment also goes for the environment and pitch surface too. A risk assessment means that you can check all these different variables, and if any seem to be a potential risk, then you can simply change that. For example, getting a new football or deflating a really hard one. So yeah, risk assessments cover a lot of things. Like I said, environment, equipment, it covers a multitude of factors, and just by using a risk assessment every time you're bringing in new equipment, once a week possibly, it can greatly reduce the chance of injuries. And then there's a direct correlation between both risk factors and prevention methods that is and that is that more prevention methods in place, the less risk there is to a player. So likewise, the less prevention methods in place, the more risk there are to a player. So it goes hand in hand. So it is very important that all these risk prevention measures are put in place to minimise the risk of injury of players. And yeah, so I'll talk about risk assessments there. There are others, but I mainly cover risk assessments just because it does cover so many other factors like equipment and environment. But yeah, there are others, but that is my 18.1 injury prevention. So thank you.